So hello, my name is Solitaire Townsend and I'm the co-founder of an organisation called Futerra. And Futerra is a change agency that's working with organisations across the world to make sustainability so desirable it becomes normal. And sitting where I am today, having this conversation with you from my home, welcome to my home, it seems obvious that that's what I do. But when I think back through the pathway that got me here, when I think of the path, the steps, perhaps they weren't all obvious, particularly from when I started out. So I started as an environmentalist, as a change maker, when I was 13 years old. I was a skinny little girl. I couldn't read or write very well. And I lived in quite a poor area for Europe. And I didn't interact very well with others. I didn't have very good social skills. And then one day on my school bus, somebody was handing out flyers, little notices about the fact that in my local area, in fact, quite near my school, a company called Nirex wanted to build a storage facility for nuclear waste, an above ground storage facility for nuclear waste. Basically, somebody wanted to dump nuclear waste by my school. And something in me clicked. Something in me decided that that was unfair. And I already thought the world was pretty unfair, but I decided that was unfair. That wasn't okay. You shouldn't be allowed to dump nuclear waste in a community like mine. And so I spoke to my parents and I convinced them to take me to some of the meetings, and we got involved, and my parents got involved and my younger sisters got involved. And I was a passionate part of that change. It taught me about how to work with adults. It taught me about what power really is. It taught me about how to make placards and walk along holding placards. And it really brought me out of myself, and it helped me find my voice and what I cared about. And I had to get better at reading and writing in order to be part of it. And I had to become more social and be able to talk to people in order to make the difference that I want. I had to become more confident. And then after 2 years of campaigning, after 2 years of, I was not a Greta, I was not a leader. I was making the tea and I was holding the placards, but I was just a child. But at the end of 2 years, we won. The campaign won. In fact, Nirex wasn't allowed to build a nuclear dump station in my community. And in fact, they weren't allowed to dump nuclear waste anywhere in the UK. And there's an image of me in the local paper, in the little newspaper for my town. There's an image of me as a 13-year-old girl with sort of pixie boots on and a big white coat on this monument we built out of bricks to our success, kind of going, yay. And I remember that moment really, really well. I remember what it felt like. And I remember this conviction that I had that if you are purposeful, if there's things you want to change about the world, if you work hard enough at it, and if you don't give up, you'll win. And that's a really dangerous thing to teach a 13-year-old girl, that if she works hard enough at something, she can change the world. And that's what I felt like I'd done. And that's this first step of the journey to what now, years later, is a 70-person company with offices in London and New York and Stockholm and Mexico City, and work everywhere from Japan to Georgia. And what it also convinced me of is the fact that you have to have fantastic communications, what I call the magic, really good messages, really powerful stories to help engage people. And you also have to have the logic, the facts, the stats, the proof and the plan. And that's what we do with our clients today. So we work with our clients on developing their big goals. We work with Google for setting their circularity policy. We work with Formula One to help them commit to go net zero. And we also do the magic. We do the storytelling. So we work with WWF on getting thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to become ocean heroes. We work with the Women's Equality Centre on projecting Donald Trump up against buildings to talk about the right to birth control. We work with Lancome on doing huge campaigns with consumers to get them to support women's rights. So we do both. We do the logic of the commitments, the plan, the real architecture of how you make change. And we do the magic of the communications and the story. And that's what I've learned over time. Those are the two things that if you put them together are really going to make change. So for my origin story, the thing which first motivated me was fairness, not environment. Actually, I got involved in environmental campaigning, particularly around the nuclear dump, because it was really unfair on the community which I was part of, which was a diverse, poor community. And that at heart, most of environmental issues are actually an injustice. And that's what I feel today. I feel that still today, the crossover between environmental issues and social issues is justice. This is what we're talking about, justice and fairness. In fact, the term climate justice, I think, is a much, much stronger term than climate action, because the individuals, particularly communities of colour, Black Indigenous communities of colour, particularly communities in poverty around the world, these are the communities which are hit most by wild, unstable weather. They're also the communities that suffer from the worst air pollution and the poorest air quality, from the worst water issues and the lack of access to water sanitation and hygiene, and the worst pollution issues. We see this particular in India and elsewhere, where it is often the communities of colour and also often the poorest communities which get affected the worst by environmental injustices. So environmental justice, climate justice, this for me is the pivot point. I'm also really aware that I am a British, well-educated, wealthy, white woman, and that the intersections between race, between gender, between LGBTQIA, between multiple issues with environment should have been faced a long time ago. A very long time ago. And like many of us who are working this movement, I have to think about, why have I not put justice right at the centre of my work from the first day? It might have been the centre of my heart, but it hasn't always been the centre of my work. However, I have to face that and I have to take action on it, rather than complain about it or ask for people's understanding. And so as Futerra moves forward, what we're doing is we're making sure that that intersection between environmental action and social justice is the heart of what we do, not least because it's not going to work without putting these issues together. Because the people who are affected most, the most affected people in areas, what people call MAPA, the most affected people in areas on environmental impacts, are almost always the most diverse areas, and in many places in the world, the most poor areas. So we absolutely have to deal with that. And we also need to understand that many of the solutions, many of the big ideas around how we solve sustainability issues are also coming from Black, Indigenous, people of colour, particularly from Indigenous communities who have for centuries managed to prove that humanity can live in balance with the environment. So rather than all of the solutions coming from people who look like Elon Musk, we need to recognise that many of the best ideas around solutions, technology, mindsets, come from Indigenous communities around the world. So this is how I see these things intersect. And this is why I don't think they're different issues. They never have been different issues. They've always been the one issue, which is justice. I remember a few years ago, actually not that long ago, just a few years ago, being at a board meeting of a very large multinational business, talking about what their big focus was going to be, what they were going to be famous for, what they were most proud of. About 14 people around the table. And we talked about climate change, we talked about forestry, and then one of them started talking about diversity and how proud they were as an organisation, of what they'd done on diversity. And they had done a lot of work across the business. However, I had to interrupt and let them know that the only woman other than myself who had spoken for the last 2 hours was the woman who asked them how they take their coffee. She was the coffee lady who came in. And all of them, every single one of them on that boardroom was a white man. And that was just a couple of years ago. So over the last 20 years, and this is the 20th year of Futerra this year, over the last 20 years, I'd like to think that my gender as a leader hasn't held me back. I worry that perhaps I will never know how it has. I'll never know the conversations or the decisions that were made about whether organisations would work with Futerra or not, depending on whether they wanted to work with a woman leader or not. So I am very, very aware of the discrimination which continues absolutely endemically across business towards women, towards Black, Indigenous people of colour, towards LGBTQIA, towards people who hold, who have particular faiths, towards people who come from backgrounds which are not the norm, towards anybody who's not what the majority leadership looks, sounds like, their backgrounds. So that is absolutely endemic. It's everywhere. Is it getting better? Well, I'm always reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi said, which is first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I've been there for the being ignored. I've been there for the being laughed at. I think right now we're in the fight. We're in a fight between those who believe the future should be equal, just, and sustainable, and those who would like to keep the future looking like the past. Those who would like to maintain the status quo. So I think we're at a tipping point of the conversation. I think we're at a tipping point of awareness. I think we're at a tipping point of anger. I don't think we're yet at a tipping point of action. Most of the companies that I work with are multinationals. They are global businesses. They have hundreds of thousands of employees. And at the very highest level in those organizations, at the very highest level in those organizations, at the board, at the ownership structure, there's two conversations that are being had: equity and climate change. So equity meaning diversity, intersectionality, gender, the inclusion, the entire D&I conversation. And the other conversation that's happening is net positive, is climate change, is how to respond to regulation, is renewable energy. So those are the two big debates that are being had in organizations. They're not always put together the way that they should have, but the language has changed. The awareness has changed. The conversation has changed, and the commitments are coming. So we're seeing commitment after commitment after commitment now coming out from organizations on equity, on social equity, on social inclusion, on diversity and inclusion, and commitments on regeneration, on climate action, on net positive. The conversation is getting there. The action, not yet. A lot more to do on the action. Has killed people. It has destroyed lives and livelihoods. It's broken businesses, and it's put so much pressure on our economies around the world. I don't think I want to call it a good thing that what's happened. It has not been a good thing. What it has been is a wake-up call. It's the first truly global challenge that affects every human being. COVID threatens every human being on the planet that I think many of us have experienced. Previous generations might have experienced, but I think this is the first of this generation that we've experienced. And I think that's creating a mindset change. What we are seeing is around the world is people becoming aware of what an essential worker is. that an essential worker is often the people that we pay the worst in our society. I think that's woken up a lot of people. I think the anger and horror and outrage at the murder of George Floyd, which went all around the world. This is not just an American issue. That horrendous footage sparked something that created conversations in every market, in every country around the world. And the issues are often different in different countries, but that it sparked a conversation around the world. And I think as many more of us, those of us who are privileged, those of us who are lucky enough to work from home, which many of my clients are, have had more time to reflect, to read, to think, to learn than perhaps we have done in previous years. So I'm finding more of my clients have read some of the books around diversity and inclusion, have watched more of the films than perhaps they would have done otherwise because they've got the time to do so. Will that prove to be a good thing? Will this prove to be a tipping point? Will this moment, 2020, 2021, the beginning of the 20s, the early 20s, will this really have been the moment, this crisis moment when we walk out? We'll never know. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't. Perhaps it will in some places in the world and perhaps it won't in other places in the world. What does really, really excite me is the young, is the people around the world. You know, the World Economic Forum does their survey every year of what is the number one concern of people around the world. And for the last few years, what the World Economic Forum has proven is the number one concern for the young, for the under 30s, is actually two. It's equity and fairness, inclusion, diversity, and climate change and environmental issues. Those are the two issues that come up again and again. Equity and climate, equity and climate, equity and climate. And that gives me an enormous amount of hope. Not because I'm expecting the young people to solve all this. That's not fair. They're not going to have all the money and the power, and they're not going to be the CEOs for years to come. What excites me about that is there's more young people, there's more Gen Zs than there is of anybody else. We are a young planet in terms of our population, we're a young planet. And all of those CEOs and government ministers, all of those leaders, all of those bosses are looking at their employees, their consumers, their voters, their populations, and they're looking at all those young people coming up and they are beginning to adapt. They're beginning to change. They're beginning to make decisions, either because they've changed their minds or because they're good at their jobs and they know they've got to change if they want those Gen Zs to buy from them and to vote for them. That hasn't come yet. Many of the Gen Zs are still too young to vote. Many of the Gen Zs are still too young they don't have enough money to buy more than the older generations do. But the direction of travel is set. There is this, it will happen sooner or it will happen later, because the generation that cares about equity and climate change more than anything else is coming. And so I think the 2020s, with this horrendous pandemic, is the start of a conversation that is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And when you and I have this conversation in 2030, I hope we look back at this interview and say, wow, we had no idea how big it was going to be.